We gather this morning with a belief and commitment to the flourishing of all life on earth. May we encounter earth's blessings and beings with awe and reverence, so that we may embody the spirit of stewardship, ever mindful of the vast, wondrous planet we call home.
On a fine September day, more than 200 years ago, a boy named John Chapman was born. Someday he would be famous, but he would be known by a different name, Johnny Appleseed. There's a little drawing of Johnny as a baby, interestingly under an apple tree. Johnny grew up in Massachusetts in a small, crowded house. And you have to remember, when he grew up in Massachusetts, it was still a very early time in our country's development. So he was kind of a colonial kid. He liked to take long walks in the woods where it was calm and quiet. He liked to feel the sun on his face and the earth under his bare feet. See Johnny walking, and he's holding an apple, isn't he? When Johnny turned 18 years old, he took a very long walk, more than 400 miles. He brought along food, supplies, a sack of apples, and a sack of apple seeds. Johnny had an idea. Settlers were starting to go west. They were going in covered wagons. Johnny figured they would want apples to eat and press into cider But there were no apple trees out west. Even if the settlers planted seeds, it would take years for trees to sprout and grow. Why not give the settlers a head start? So way up here is Massachusetts. You've heard of Boston, maybe? The Celtics, if you know basketball. And he came the whole way down through New York State, in through Pennsylvania, touching into Maryland, over to Ohio, and eventually ended up in Indiana. And there's a picture of Johnny as a young 18-year-old guy with his sack shirt and hat and big bag of apples and seeds. Johnny reached Pennsylvania. Near a river, he found a patch of land with rich soil and plenty of sunlight, a perfect place for growing apple trees. He planted some seeds. Then he built a sturdy fence so that when the new seedlings came up, deer and rabbit wouldn't eat them. It was his first nursery. Johnny planted more seeds, thousands of them, across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. He worked and he walked, going from nursery to tend the trees he had planted as seeds. Meanwhile, the settlers came. Sure enough, they wanted apples. They were happy to pay Johnny a few cents apiece for seedlings. You know what a seedling is? It's a little baby tree, right? Sometimes he even gave away seedlings to families who were down on their luck. So there's a covered wagon. And do you know where the covered wagons first were built? Anybody know that? Just next door in Lancaster County along the Conestoga River. How about that? We're an important part of history right here. People spread the word about Johnny and his apple trees. That's how he got his nickname. Have you met Johnny Appleseed? He's mighty kind to people, mighty peculiar too. It was true. For one thing, Johnny looked strange. He wore an old, ragged pair of pants. He cut holes in a coffee sack to make his shirt. He still didn't wear shoes. By now, folks claimed his feet were so tough a snake's fangs couldn't prick them. People even swore they saw Johnny wear a tin pot for a hat, and then cook his dinner in it after that. Johnny's diet was another thing. People couldn't get over it. He didn't like to hunt animals. He wouldn't hurt them, so he wouldn't eat meat. Not one bite. He filled up on corn mush, potatoes, and nuts instead. And when night fell, Johnny liked to sleep outdoors. He'd settle into a hollow log or stretch out onto a pile of leaves. He didn't seem to worry about bears and panthers that roamed the woods. It was almost as if Johnny was a forest creature himself. Johnny might have been odd, but he was friendly. He got along with just about everyone he met. Native Americans shared their trails with him. They showed him which berries were safe to eat and how to make medicine from roots and from leaves. Settlers invited Johnny into their cabins and asked him to tell stories. Sometimes he'd read from the Bible. Good news, fresh from heaven, he would say. Other times, he acted out his own wild adventures. And I'm not sure, but I think I see Johnny making his way right here up front now. Welcome, Johnny. I see you've got your pot. Johnny retold tales, and they grew bigger as he would retell them. For years went by, the tales grew taller and taller. Why, did you know that Johnny can thaw ice with his bare feet? He has a tame wolf that follows him around like a puppy and carries his apple sack. Once he tricked 10 woodsmen into a chopping contest. They cleared a whole acre of land for a nursery. How about that? That's a lot of chopping. The stories wound their way east and west and back again. So did Johnny. He traveled hundreds of miles a year, making new nurseries and tending the old nurseries. Every so often, he rode a horse or he paddled a canoe, but most of the time he walked. and walked and walked. He kept this up for more than 50 years. One day, when he was 70 years old, Johnny walked out through a snowstorm to fix a fence around some of his trees. But afterwards, he fell ill, and then he died. Johnny was surely missed, but he was not forgotten, and neither was his great idea. As settlers moved farther and farther west, they carried along apple seeds, just as Johnny had. They planted apple trees on their own. Today, apples grow in every state in America. So, I hope you enjoyed the story about Johnny Appleseed, and it was unusual to have Johnny here today, but he brought a couple of apples that he's going to share with the first 4 people that need an apple. And after you eat the apple, don't forget, what are you going to do? What are you going to do after you eat the apple?
Plant the seeds.
That's right, plant the seeds, right?
Yeah, plant the seeds.
So, thank you for listening. It was great seeing you. Happy Earth Day.
Our reading this morning is On the Fifth Day by Jane Hirschfield. On the 5th day, the scientists who studied the rivers were forbidden to speak or to study the rivers. The scientists who studied the air were told not to speak of the air. And the ones who worked for the farmers were silenced, and the ones who worked for the bees. Someone from deep in the Badlands began posting facts. The facts were told not to speak and were taken away. Now it was only the rivers that spoke of the rivers, and only the wind that spoke of its bees, while the unpausing factual buds of the fruit trees continued to move toward their fruit. The silence spoke loudly of silence, and the rivers kept speaking of rivers, of boulders and air. In gravity, earless and tongueless, the untested rivers kept speaking. Bus drivers, shelf stockers, code writers, machinists, accountants, lab techs, cellists kept speaking. They spoke, the 5th day, of silence.
As you may already know, I have been working with the Unitarian Universalist Ministry for Earth for over about a year now. Yeah, exactly. Last year doing Earth Day service and a program, and then I took over as the interim director, and now I get to be a consultant and work on curriculum and things. And my motivation to join the wonderful team of people at UU Ministry for Earth is my commitment to get more UUs, and frankly, everyone, everywhere, not just thinking about the fragile state of our planet, but also doing something every day to address that fragility. As such, I thought I'd talk about our role in ensuring that all life on this precious planet can flourish. Our reading talks about silence, and it talks about speaking. The challenge of speaking up when voices have been or are continuing to be systematically silenced. And when I reflect on this reading, I'm reminded of that wonderful line in the Dr. Seuss book, The Lorax, when our little orange friend, the Lorax, turns to the Onceler and says, "I speak for the trees have no tongues." Then he goes on to speak for the barbaloots, the swami swams, and the fish. He took it upon himself to give voice to the voiceless, to give voice to that which has been ignored or actively silenced. However, if we are really paying attention, we realize that the trees and the seas and the bees have all been speaking to us for quite some time. We just haven't been listening. Now, many of us in this room are old enough to remember that in 1976, President Jimmy Carter installed solar panels on the roof of the White House. This little tidbit of information alone should remind us that people, including some people in power, were listening to scientists and have known for a long time that we needed to rethink our dependence on fossil fuels and utilize what is often called alternative energy sources or renewable energy. You also probably know then that when Ronald Reagan became president, his first act was to remove those panels from the White House. And alas, we've been paying for that decision ever since. The really sad part is, though, that some people pay a higher price for that dependence on fossil fuels than others. And it's usually not the folks who are releasing the most carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Our siblings in the global south and what the West calls underdeveloped nations, but we really know what we mean, nations that have been colonized, marginalized, and actively exploited and destabilized by the United States, England, and other colonial powers. They're the ones who feel it the most. Climate change does not impact each of us equally. The United States and China are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, thus the most to blame, as it were, for our current climate chaos. And yet it is our human family across the globe who already suffer challenges and indignities due to structural violence, systemic racism, and the horrific legacy of colonialism, who feel the effects most. Our self-centered, myopic way of living has caused unspeakable harm to humans. It has also caused unspeakable harm to mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, trees, on and on. I almost hate to state some of these statistics out loud, but in the last 50 years, we have lost 70% of wildlife on this planet. A cursory glance at the news, and we read about the death of 1 billion snow crabs in the Pacific Northwest, and the loss of salmon runs, and the decrease in pollinators. You notice there's not that many bugs hitting your windshields anymore, and on and on. But I'm not here today to list all the harm and suffering, because I know that you already know that. What I do want to focus on is what can be done about it. Now, each spring semester, I teach a course at Vassar College entitled Science, Spirituality, and Peace Education, Addressing Climate Change. And one of the many things we discuss in the class is the notion of responsibility. We actually pick apart the question, do our individual acts matter? I was inspired to add that question to the syllabus a couple of years ago because of a podcast I listened to, and they were debating the notion of individual versus systemic responsibility. Spoiler alert, both matter, but to different degrees. The reality is that we need to transform our entire way of life, way of thinking, way of doing, way of being. which means systemic change. But one part of getting there is through individual shifts in how we live and what we model for our friends, our neighbors, and family, and even strangers for that matter. Every choice we make has lasting impact, which is challenging, especially when we can so easily feel overwhelmed or exhausted by the sheer enormity of the task. Now, in the class and in the workshop, where I met some of you that I lead for UU Ministry for Earth, Ecology as Scripture, we focus on how we facilitate this shift on both the personal and systemic levels. So in my regular search for inspiration for the work, I found this quote last fall by St. Francis of Assisi. Quote, "Remember that when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing that you have received, only what you have given, a full heart, enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage." It invited me then to reflect on how we UUs show up in the world. For the most part, we do good, right? I think so. We're at protests. We fight for human rights. We create welcoming congregations or green sanctuaries. But I also know that we can hide behind that do-gooder liberalness of our faith tradition. We can fall into a kind of comfortable nonchalance, thinking that perhaps we do enough. But the stakes are much too high. We have less than 6 years to fix things. 6 years. And all those corporations who spend millions of dollars on their greenwashing ads, and boy, did you see a whole lot of them around Earth Day this weekend, right? All these things, right? There's still ads, but they say things like, "We'll do this by 2050. Too late. They try to convince us that each of us and our individual choices, like taking shorter showers or changing the light bulbs, is what's going to make the difference. Smoke and mirrors. Remember, it was British Petroleum, BP, who created the carbon footprint game to shift the focus from oil-promoting corporations to day-to-day citizens. Fun fact, right? So, of course, we should take shorter showers. Absolutely. Yes, we should use LEDs. Absolutely. We should definitely stop buying plastic or fast fashion. And we should eat less meat and eat locally, support local agriculture and local farms. And yes, I know that you are doing wonderful things. I love that you're reforesting a part of your campus and that you grow food and donate it to folks in need. And I most especially love that you offer this beautiful landscape to children to explore nature. So yes to all of that. And demand that these aforementioned companies stop creating plastics in the first place. Demand that these companies stop investing in fossil fuels. Demand that your community makes local food actually affordable and accessible. Demand that your town, I don't know what your public transit is like, but mine is pretty abysmal. But what if we improve public transportation and then we actually use it? And demand that politicians think 7 generations into the future instead of focusing only on the here and now and themselves and the folks who are greasing their palms. As Hope Jaron, whom I adore, in her book, The Story of More, she says, "All species will go extinct eventually, even our own. It is one of nature's few imperatives. As of today, however, that train has not quite left the station. We still have some control over our demise, namely how long it will take and how much our children and grandchildren will suffer. If we want to take action, we should get started while it still matters what we do." So what can we do? Obviously, we will start with the things that we stated earlier that I'm sure most of you are doing already. But then we have to be more courageous. We have the chance now to do something courageous that can change the course of humanity, and in doing so, may just allow all life on earth to thrive. We need the courage to usher in a new way of living and a new way of being. Courage is key because it's not going to be the small personal things we do that matter most. We need the courage to think beyond ourselves, to raise awareness, to subvert the system, to say, hey, you know, capitalism and this American excess way of life is actually killing us all. I am one of the core organizers of the Rivers and Mountains Green Faith Circle, which operates in Ulster, Greene, Columbia, and Dutchess counties in New York. And we've been doing awareness-raising interfaith actions for about 2 years. One of our offerings, done by my friend and colleague Michael Richardson, is a workshop on how to divest money from fossil fuels. Things as quotidian as where you bank, where you get your insurance, what credit cards you use, and how you invest your money can actually make a huge difference. Some of you may have already participated in actions such as these, protesting banks, or on March 21st, joining in the action that Third Act put forth to divest. And here's what you need to know. Chase Bank has invested a total of $382 billion in fossil fuels in the last 5 years. Citibank, $285 billion. Wells Fargo, $272 billion. Bank of America, $232 billion. And even TD Bank, I saw a bunch of those around here, $141 billion. If you bank with any of these institutions, it's time for you to break up with them. And it's also time to demand that they do better. At the start of this academic year, I learned that my employer had invited Chase Bank to be our bank on campus. This information added to the fact that, as faculty, I am forced to handle my retirement plan through Fidelity, which holds $167 billion in fossil fuel stocks, made smoke come out of my ears. I read the email and thought, do I just let this go? And the answer was no. I want to point out though, I'm a visiting professor on a renewable contract, so I was a bit afraid of taking this on. But I did. I wrote to the comptroller of the college and asked for a meeting. I showed up with pages of information about the dirty dozen, and it's way more than 12, and how using Chase and Fidelity and even TIAA, and I'm sorry to say that, but there's a dark side there, and I've been an educator, and yeah, I'm working that out. I know. It's counter to the values we espouse at Vassar College. And it goes without saying that these kinds of investments and these limited choices are counter to my values as a UU. They listened, they seemed to understand, and Chase is still the bank on campus. I then sent all my materials to a colleague who serves on the retirement committee, and we talked about it, and he listened, and he definitely understood, and he said he'd shared it with the committee, but he had no idea what would happen. We still have Fidelity and TIA there. Okay, that's what happened. On the surface, my effort seems like a failure. Nothing changed this year. But the college is now clearly aware that someone is watching. Someone is bothered by our backdoor connection to the killing of all life on the planet. And maybe my being a little pest, maybe I should think more positively and call myself more like a truth teller, might have people reconsider. But I do know that had I said nothing, then nothing would ever change. And then just this March, the 21st, was the third act day of action, about a dozen of my students and I organized a protest right down the street from campus in front of Bank of America. I merely suggested the idea in class when we were talking about this, and 3 students jumped right on it. We actually went inside chanting, "When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace." And boy, the bank manager was not pleased. And my students just looked at me, and I said, "We'll leave." And that's it. And we left, and we went back to our spot on the sidewalk. But those dozen students who came with me, they learned a really important lesson that day. So here's the thing. People who are in power, who are serving their god of greed, will never change unless we have the courage to force them to. And some of that courage is also us realizing that business as usual, if it has served us well, is actually harmful. And thus we need to give up our own comforts, not all, but some of our comforts and privileges, so we can do better by those who don't have the same comforts and privileges. Divestment is definitely one way to do this. We can also be sure that our candidate, and we only have one candidate, but maybe there'll be more for UU president, is clearly going to address climate and environmental issues. We can also make sure that the candidates we vote for in general actually have planet Earth on our agenda. And I do believe it's really important that we hold this denomination accountable for what we do. We are the UUA, and we can use our voices to ask the UUA to do better. I don't know if you know this, but the UUA has money invested in a number of these dirty banks, including also fossil fuel companies, ConocoPhillips, to name one. So think about Willow Pipeline and the UUA direct connection. You can demand those lists, by the way, if you want. And so I think we have to act and ask our denomination to do better. I don't know if you noticed, but the Presbyterians have already made sure that they have divested entirely from fossil fuels. I can't believe they beat us to it. I'm actually a little mad about that. So note to self, I'll put a little plug that there's a resolution being presented by the Young Adults for Divestment at GA asking for the UUA to divest their funds from fossil fuels. Just be prepared. So I guess what I'm talking about is having the courage to disrupt the status quo, and then to have the courage to live differently, which may mean living with less, living more simply, maybe having less return on retirement funds, maybe living more mindfully, and making decisions with all earthly life in mind, not just our own. And you know what else? While we live during these challenging times, right, our democracy seems to be in peril, our planet is suffering, our siblings of color still being tortured and killed, the right to bear arms being greater than the right to letting children and teenagers or the average person just live, I believe it is an act of courage to be hopeful. In her latest book, Active Hope, Joanna Macy invites us to live in this space of active hope. I know that for many of us, myself included, the enormity of this task at hand can make us feel, like I said, overwhelmed or ineffective or small or useless or sad or depressed, any of those things. Maybe even so far as going to thinking, someone else will take care of it. But we are it. We're all we've got. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Joanna Macy puts forth many ideas on how to foster this active hope and work in community. And I'm going to tell you about one activity that I think we could even do it in our own minds every day. She encourages, though, that you do it with a partner and you walk through these different sentences. They move you from gratitude to honoring the pain of the world into seeing things with new eyes and then determining what part you'd like to play in going forth. So maybe if we all just took a little time, either in a conversation or in our morning when we put our feet on the floor, to take some time to name what we are grateful for. Then take a moment to think about what makes our hearts heavy. Then imagine the world we want to see. And then make a decision about what we will do to bring that vision to life. We might feel more hopeful. And we might, one courageous, defiant, disrupting step at a time, change the world. May it be so. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. The desire that life continue is far larger than we are. When the choices we make are guided by this desire, we can imagine around us the cheering of all who share it. The ancestors, the future beings, the natural world itself. May you carry this spirit into your week. Go in peace, and thank you for being here. Amen.